Hi, this is Alan Gassman, and it's hard to believe it's already the flat middle of February, actually a little bit more than the middle of February, Tuesday, 2015, 12:30 p.m. I hope you're enjoying your lunch. And welcome John Goldsmith from the Trim & Kempfer Law Firm to talk about this crazy and often difficult situation we have with BP claims, a newly established deadline, and a lot of, quite candidly, trickery when it comes to deciding whether you have a claim and how to calculate that claim for certain industries. What we're going to find out from John is that a lot of potential BP claimants who were told they did not have claims under what we thought the old method was of calculations actually will have claims. So John, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Janine, if you want to click the slide here, just to let you know that as viewers, there's some other webinars you may want to attend. We have 3 webinars on life insurance situations. We have premium financing on March 4th. We have split dollar on March 17th. And we have financial strength and risk comparisons of life insurance companies on March 31st. These are not to sell life insurance. These are to provide information for those of us who are more cautious about life insurance. Thursday, March 5th, how to handle stressful matters with Srikumar Rao. And March 24th, structuring joint exempt step-up trusts. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide now. And John, what the heck is going on with the BP world?
So we've been waiting to find out what the deadline would be to file BP claims. You would think the settlement agreement provides for it. It does, but it says it is 6 months after the last opportunity that anyone has to appeal the settlement once that is expired. And the Supreme Court denied certiorari review of BP's appeal of the settlement on December 8th. As a result of that, the BP Claims Administrator is posting that the deadline is June 8th, 2015, and everybody should assume that that is the date. If we go to the next slide, we see that it's possible the deadline might be later. It probably is, because BP still had the right to seek reconsideration by the Supreme Court, and they had a few-week period of time to do that. But the BP Claims Administrator is insisting it's June 8th. You should assume it's going to be June 8th. And the other thing I think that's important to recognize is that it takes, in most instances, months to prepare a BP claim. So get the information to the lawyers and the accountants. We've got to gather and analyze the information, particularly in light of Policy 495 that we're going to talk about. There really are very, very complex and difficult issues to properly present the claim. And given the new complexities that have been set as a result of the Policy 495 and the other rules, it is very, very important that information be submitted and provided as soon as possible. We are telling people internally they need to get the information to us by early April so we can analyze it and ask for additional information. And then the
John,
next slide. Yeah.
Yeah, John, if they extend the deadline, when would they likely extend it? What date would we know that they're going to extend it?
There's no way to know, and I think that's why everybody needs to assume that the deadline is June 8th, because they'll just post it on the website. Somebody is going to raise the issue and say, oh, this isn't really the deadline. But we don't know, and there's no reason to get into a lawsuit or an argument about what the deadline is. Our intention in our law firm is to try to get everything filed at the very latest by May 15th, because we just don't want to be close. We don't want to potentially take any issues with being late, because once you miss a deadline, there's not anything you can do about it.
Okay, very good.
So the next slide, we now talk about what has really become the issue in all of the BP claims, and that is Policy 495. Policy 495 was put together by the BP Claims Administrator with input from BP, with input from the Plaintiff Steering Committee, with approval of the court, and it has revolutionized the way these claims are being considered. Generally for the worst. Generally it's making claims lower or eliminating claims, and in other instances it is actually greatly, it's helping claims. But that's usually rare. The settlement agreement's provision for subtracting corresponding variable expenses requires, according to the way this has been interpreted, that revenue must be matched with variable expenses incurred by a claimant in conducting its business. And that does not necessarily coincide with when the revenue and variable expenses were recorded. This is a significant change. Prior to Policy 495, as long as the revenue and variable expenses were recorded in the normal course of business and there was not, quote unquote, a mistake, then Policy 495 said you looked at when the revenues were recorded. Now Policy 495 completely upturns that entire approach, and instead it does something which has little meaning in the accounting world in the way they've focused on it, and that is what they call matching revenue with expenses. So what does this really mean? In the next slide, we see that it's being applied to different types of businesses in a different way. We have not actually seen certain businesses yet, how they've been applied, but we have three that they've been examined. In general, if there are claims that they call are unmatched, where the expenses are not matched with the revenue. What they mean by that is that the revenue is not coming in the month when the expense that was incurred to generate that revenue occurred. Well, that rarely occurs. It occurs in restaurants pretty close to the time it's incurred. You buy food, you make it, you serve it, it doesn't stay around very long. But even in restaurants, they are doing a matching of revenue in a way that is tying in when the produce, when the meat, when the underlying goods were bought, and then to the extent that it extends to a different month, they're actually going back and attempting to reallocate that information. It is incredibly time-consuming. It is a boondoggle, with all due respect to the accountants who are doing this. And the second bullet point here is that it depends on the specifics of a given business, where the court says it may be appropriate to make adjustments to the claimant's financials as to the timing of the recognition of either revenues or expenses or both. And in many types of businesses, the BP claims accountants are doing both. They are changing what is normally GAAP, what is normally the way the books have always been kept by a company, and they are changing the timing of the recognition of both revenues or expenses in ways that sometimes have a tendency, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but of what BP would claim is smoothing out the revenues. And smoothing out the revenues means you don't have revenue spikes, you're much less likely to have a claim, and that's why this has been so adversely affected by so many claimants. On the other hand, as Alan pointed out, there are certain instances, they are unusual, but we have seen several instances in which claimants who did not have claims, that once Policy 495 is applied and you spread the revenues and expenses and you tie them together you tie the revenue into when the expense was incurred to generate that revenue, then all of a sudden we have seen in several instances situations in which businesses that did not have claims now have claims. So I thought we would look at three types of businesses in which we now have actual experience where I have seen on claims that I have been involved in multiple determinations by the BP claims administrator. And in addition to actually getting claim determinations, we have actually fielded questions on many, many other claims where we're waiting for the determinations. And so we now have a much, much better idea of how we think these claims are going to be determined. The first claim that I'd like to talk about on the next slide are nonprofits. Now, nonprofits it was first very much unclear, how do you match revenue with expenses? Very, very unclear. In November 2012, the BP Claims Administrator issued regulations that said that for a nonprofit, revenues include gifts and grants. And that was approved by the court. BP never appealed it. They're now trying to attack that ruling now, almost 2 years later. But revenue includes gifts and grants. Now, in looking at the way Policy 495 is applied, there's a significant distinction between nonprofits, which have primarily or only gift and grant income, not nonprofits that provide housing or food or provide money to other nonprofits. And all they do essentially is they are raising money and using it. They don't provide any service. They don't provide any sale of any items that would result in the generation of revenue, such as museums, performing arts, and concert venues, or nonprofits that may operate some type of a retail store in connection with their business. And there's an important difference there because of what BP has started to do with restricted gifts and the restricted grants that we'll talk about in a minute, to the extent that an organization has no income generated from sales. It tends to be very, very reliant on what happens to the treatment of these gifts and grants. Because the issue in not-for-profits is, when was the revenue recognized? This makes more of a difference in nonprofits than in any other entity, and we have seen every question we're getting on nonprofits for organizations are questions that relate to, when are we going to recognize the revenue? And it is the questions we're getting on essentially every single question. So in the next slide, we talk about really the three issues that we think most significantly affects the claims, for better or for worse, usually for worse. The first is a claim is where money comes in and it is paid into an endowment. BP has made no formal policy determination on this, and this is an issue that is presently up on appeal through the appeal and reconsideration process at BP. But in one claim, BP determined that if money's paid in an endowment, that if the money comes in, let's say by way of example, in September 2009, well, in September 2010, which is one of the months that can allow you to have a BP claim, you didn't get that same contribution. That's a basis to calculate a claim. And what they're saying is that if the money is limited in use to interest only, then in this one claim, they're saying that money did not all come in that month. Only the interest on that endowed money came in on that month, and then you apply the interest from that endowment every single month. You don't include the entire gift in the month in which it was received. there really is no basis for that. This really doesn't have anything to do with Policy 495. But their view is we're looking at money that is available to the organization. And that leads to the second problem with nonprofit claims, and that has to do with restricted gifts. If a gift is restricted to a particular purpose or use, and it can't be used in the month in which the money has come in, we have seen that BP claims accountants, and they have not been entirely consistent, but that they say that money needs to be spread out over the months in which that money is spent for its restricted purpose. If the money was given to buy food for a period of 3 months, and that money is given in September, they're going to spread it over September, October, and November. That could help a claim. In many instances, it's going to hurt a claim. But they're looking at the purpose of the gifts and not just looking at the date those gifts were given. And then a particular type of restricted gift, we still don't know what BP is going to do. And I have had a lot of discussions with claims accountants about how they're going to handle capital campaigns. Capital campaigns is a very particular type of restricted gift. It says we're giving you this money, and the purpose of it is to build a building, to renovate a wing in a building, to do something that is going to be of long-term use. And so the question is, if the money's to build a building, is it then spread out over the time it took the building to be built? Is it spread out over the life of the building, a 40-year or 50-year life of a building? It does not make any sense. But those are the issues we are struggling with BP. And this really gets to a point I'm going to make later in this webinar, and that is when the BP claims accounts calls and asks questions, the biggest mistake that people give is they volunteer and they give too much information instead of just answering the questions that are asked. Instead of giving full, complete answers to questions, people volunteer information, and the result of volunteering information allows all sorts of additional questions and examination. The one thing we know is the BP claims accountants are thoroughly reading and looking at everything. I think they often misinterpret what they're reading, but I think if you give them things that they don't ask for, you are asking for a lengthier process and a more likely process or more likely outcome that they may misunderstand something and reduce or potentially even eliminate the claim. We had one not-for-profit claim recently adjudicated at approximately 3.5% of how the claim was filed as a result of an endowment, as a result of a restricted gift, and it decimated the claim. That one is presently on appeal. That's one of the issues that we have in terms of the kinds of information that BP is looking at. On the next slide, we see the second type of claim that we've seen a lot of activity on, because these are really the easiest. These are retail claims. And on retail claims, these are stores that are selling products, and the typical thing that's used is that they need to have data, and they will ask for data sometimes about when items were purchased and when those items were sold. They want to know what information you have to show that information. And if they don't have that, they will apply what is called the AVM methodology, the annual variable margin methodology. And this usually is very, very bad for claims, because they will take the margin, the variable margin over the course of a year, and they will spread it out equally over every month. So that has a tendency of smoothing out or getting rid of spikes in revenue and smoothing out revenue so it tends to reduce claims and sometimes eliminate the claims. So when there's no support for revenue, the annual variable margin methodology is used. There are ways you can try to avoid that by saying, well, the average shelf of our inventory, the average length of time our inventory stays on the shelf is 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks. If you provide that information to them, then that can change things dramatically. If you're a convenience store, you can probably show the average time our product stays on the shelf is short. It's a few weeks. And in some instances, they seem to recognize that these are industries that by their very nature, restaurants, for example, don't have inventory that stays on their shelves for a long time period. But that's what they're looking at. They are looking at the timing of the revenue recognition and anything you can provide them to show that the information on the profit and loss statement about when revenues and expenses are booked is roughly the same in the same month. If you can avoid them going through and applying the annual variable margin, then you will generally be in a much better shape. First, the claim will be determined a lot faster. So the key issue is, what is the timing of activities that earn revenue? These are very, very difficult and complicated issues. I have been hired to handle several reconsiderations and appeals of either denial of claims or claims have been significantly reduced because information was provided in response to accountant questions without understanding what the accountant was really getting at. They were getting at, is there information to support the timing of activities to earn revenues? And when they found there wasn't that support, they then applied this annual variable margin methodology, which ruined the claim, particularly of retail facilities. And in many instances, retail stores have this information. They track inventory. They track all of that. And so it's important to go through to know what they're really looking for. And when they're asking a question, you want to provide a full, fair, and complete answer. You don't want to volunteer information. But when they're trying to find support for the timing of activities to earn revenue, you want to have a lot of involvement with the client, the accounting department, and it's important. We spend a lot of time looking at that information to see if there's anything we can provide to the claims accountants to support the timing of activities to earn revenue, particularly with retail. The next slide has a last.
Well, John, before we go there, there's just going to be a lot of mistakes made on the claims side, it sounds like.
We see it all the time, and we see it on the appeals or reconsiderations when claims are denied, and it's a lot more difficult to deal with it, Alan, much more difficult to deal with it when it's after the claim has already been determined, because they've provided incomplete or sometimes even information that might come off of a ledger, but it's not necessarily reflect the reality of what's happening in the business. You can't just take information and dump it on the BP claims accountants. You have to review it and analyze it, and you have to know, what are they really asking for? And that's really the big problem. When in the next slide that talks about the issues with retail claims, it really does look at these three issues. When are goods purchased versus when goods are sold? That's a very, very significant issue that we've been talking about the last few minutes. The second thing is they're always asking for in owner-officer compensation, benefits, and bonuses, even in big companies, because they're going to take that money and they're going to allocate it and say, if you paid the money to the owner as salary or benefits, that's the same thing as if the company made a profit. So they'll pull out owner-officer compensation from the expense model and it makes a big difference if you can submit the claim correctly by pulling out the owner-officer compensation to begin with, because they're going to ask for that in every case. Believe it or not, they ask for it even in nonprofits where it doesn't make sense. The last issue with retail claims is internet versus bricks and mortar stores, and of course many businesses do both. The answer to that question is there is no difference. They treat internet sales, even if you're selling to Europe. I had a company that was selling most of their products to Europe. They were based on their store was based on the beach. They had actually no bricks and mortar sales. It was all internet. It didn't matter. And so they're continuing to treat the settlement the way that it should be treated. So there is no difference. And even if you have an internet business and you have no bricks and mortars, your client can still have a claim. And the questions are the same, and you still have to go through all the same issues. But retail sales on the internet, there really is no difference in how they're treated. That's one of the mistakes that we've seen a lot of people make, where they said, well, but they're only internet sales. They're selling most of their products outside of the Gulf zone. It doesn't matter. They still have a claim. So the last category of claims that we're going to talk about in the next slide are medical practices. And this has been an issue that BP has appealed and sought review on every single time. We've had several medical practice claims determined, and that is they argue medical practices are professional services. But the medical practices and all the medical fields have what's called an industry code, an NAISC code, that is separate from professional services. And the claims administrator, fortunately, has not treated medical practices as professional services. And that's important now because professional services, there are a new set of rules. We have heard from the BP claims accountants that professional services are being put at the bottom of the stack. It's going to be a long time before the claims of accountants and lawyers and real estate appraisers and all that, although we had several determined pre-495. After policy 495, they're going to be toward the end. But medical practices are not professional services. And so they treat the earned versus paid differently than professional services. They will typically use annual variable margin, but that's okay because with medical practices, it actually works out pretty well. You bill in Medicare, you might get paid in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, depending on what system you have. Insurance, depending on what the insurance company is. And the annual variable margin actually has worked pretty well for medical practices. And it's resulted in very little change in the amount of the claim for medical practices. It's slightly increased it for some, it's slightly reduced it for others, but the annual variable margin actually works pretty well for medical practices. But the big issue with medical practices is the owner-officer compensation. If we're working on a medical practice that has 1 doctor or 2 doctors, their compensation, whether they keep the money in the professional organization in the medical practice or they pay it to themselves, is really completely irrelevant, and they treat that as profit. And so they're very, very sensitive to those issues. And oftentimes, the amount of the claim ends up being directly related to the drop in income that a physician may have during some 3-month time period between May and December of 2010 in comparison to previous years during that same time period. So the owner-officer compensation we see is an issue they look at quite a bit. And this really goes to now my next 2 bullet points, which is important not just for medical practices, but it's important for every one of these claims, and it's, again, issues that I unfortunately see when we get asked to handle reconsiderations or appeals of claims that are denied or greatly reduced. The questions come in from the accountants for the VP claims administrator, and whenever a question comes in, it's important to recognize the reason for the question. You still supply honest, concise information, but you don't volunteer information that's not requested. The only time you ever volunteer information that's not requested is if you think, based on the information that's being provided, that the information is providing a misleading portrait to the claims administrator. We see this happen sometimes, and so that's why it's important, if you recognize a reason for the question, then sometimes you can provide information and say, oh, well, you're trying to figure out why is the revenue recognized in this month? What's the expense related to that revenue recognized in this month? Oh, no, it all occurred in the same month, or it occurred in the previous month, but we can tie it all in together because if you look at the revenue stream and the expense stream, they're all directly related. And a lot of times you can provide that information. But if you don't know the reason for the question, because you don't know what they're looking at in these different medical practice, nonprofit, retail claims, construction we haven't even talked about, professional services have not yet been adjudicated, educational institutions, all of these, there are unique reasons for these questions. And it's a difficult and complex issue. And if you simply provide information, oh, I just want to get rid of them type of an approach, that's when bad things happen to claims. That's when you don't fully recognize and appreciate what's happening to claims. And this is also why sometimes claims that were reviewed and determined not to have valid claims might have claims under Policy 495. It's worth getting it reviewed. If you were close, it's worth getting it reviewed. If there were dramatic differences, if you didn't even come close to having a claim, Policy 495 will probably not help you. But if you were close and you just missed it, it is certainly worth having another review, and we're certainly happy to do that review again for you. We have found not many, but we have found a few claims where people did not have claims under the prior before pre-495, and they have claims now. So in my last slide, the issues really to focus on in the BP claims is the deadline is approaching very, very fast. And it is dangerous to wait until, well, I'll get to this on April 15th or on May 1st. It's very dangerous. The deadline's approaching. These are issues that need to be addressed. Information needs to be gathered because it is important to be careful and precise in both the presentation of the claims and in answering the BP claims administrator's questions. And the more time that we have with the information, the more we have the ability to analyze it and thoroughly review the claim, the better we're going to be able to present the information. The last summary that is true for all these claims is, with the one limited exception, which is when you recognize a reason for the question, and that means you've got to know the BP settlement. When you recognize a reason for the question, then you may want to volunteer and provide information so the claims accountant understands particularly the issue of when revenue and expenses were recognized, so you don't get put into this issue where they're applying a methodology, the annual variable expense methodology and revenue methodology, where they're taking the revenue and spreading it, smoothing the revenue over the year. But with that exception, and only when you fully understand the data that you're providing, don't volunteer information. Don't provide more that's asked. If they're asking for what's your support for this revenue figure, if you have a cancel check, give them the cancel check. If they want more, they'll ask. But if you provide all this data, then they're going to go through and search through it, and they're going to find all sorts of issues that are going to lead to additional questions. In short, the BP claims process is moving. We're getting questions. We're getting claim determinations. But it is a complex and difficult process. And Alan and I are more than happy to help any of you that have issues that may come up. But the sooner you talk to us, the better. Once a claim is determined, once information that wasn't requested is provided, once you have not provided information which might have really helped the claims accountant calculate and determine the claim appropriately but wasn't provided, and then the claim's determined, it's much more difficult for us to go back at that point in time and try to seek reconsideration or appeal the claim. Thank you all very much. We will probably have another update on BP claims in perhaps a month or so once we get some additional claims determinations, and I think we'll have a good idea how not only these three categories of claims are being determined, but how several other claims are being determined where we are waiting for determinations that we anticipate will come very quickly. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much. That was a very interesting and very well-organized summary of an extremely detailed and disorganized body of law that seems to be growing in some sort of a strange petri dish, maybe mutated by BP substances in the water. All I can do is say that we really appreciate all your help, and it's going to be pretty sad when a lot of BP claimants who thought they didn't have a claim because of the old way of doing things might find out later that they would have had a claim if they had rerun the numbers based on this modified accrual method. I hope you'll come back and join us again, and thanks again for taking a big part of your day out to prepare this PowerPoint and to provide us with this excellent presentation. Attendees, if you have any questions at all, you can email John or me. I'm Gassman at gassman.com, and may the rest of your time today be billable.